Welcome to Shakespeare's England, 1560s to the 1610s. My name is Melinda Cole Klein. The Elizabethan era is often referred to as a golden age. With it came an artistic renaissance that included literature, art, and theatrical drama. Writings by geographers and voyaging diarists created a vibrant new genre of literature that included travel accounts, descriptive observations, illustrations, and maps. Such publications inspired state exploration and colonial ventures. Thanks to John Smith, the first governor of the Jamestown settlement, any prospective colonist considering the trip to America knew something about the region. After leaving Virginia, Smith explored and mapped the New England coast. He published in 1616 a description of New England, proclaiming it a, quote, paradise all planted with corn, groves, mulberries, had good harbors, high clay sandy cliffs, end of quote. Under Henry VIII and his daughter Queen Elizabeth I, England expanded its economy. Exports since the Middle Ages included textiles, printed books, and furniture by acquiring cheap raw materials from tropical areas around the world, such as wood and cloth dyes. Instead of trading with Spain, advocates of colonization argued that by building English colonies in warmer climes and to have these colonies shipped back to the manufacturing centers in Britain their goods extracted, this supported economic growth. By the late Elizabethan era, early colonization efforts failed with Roanoke. English publications and travel accounts contained illustrated imagery, maps, and observations of land filled with game, timber, and untold riches up for grabs. After the failure of Roanoke, Richard Hakluyt kept alive the dream of English colonies in North America. Advocates of colonial expansion argued that North American mainland and the fishing areas off the coast of Newfoundland and Nova Scotia promised great profits for adventurers. By 1563, Queen Elizabeth and her government settled the religious meandering that had been taking place after the death of Henry VIII. Shortly before the death of Edward VI, the 42 articles that had been drawn up, Queen Elizabeth made changes. This effort resulted in the 39 articles defining Anglican doctrine. During this reign, Catholicism continued to decline, but splinter groups known as the Marians kept this spirit alive in minor circles until its full decline by 1600. This effort was not credited to efforts by the state authority, but to the efforts by local clergy. All the while, Puritans who desired reforms to Anglican doctrines grew in number to include priests, nobles, to the gentry, to tradesmen and farmers. A small religious group known to history as the Separatists received harsher treatments. To this post-Calvinist sect, Separatists argued that a civil authority should not be the head of a religious body. They were in favor of the separation of church and state, revolutionary idea of its day that carried a charge of treason. Before 1590, England had been able to match food resources to the existing population. As an agrarian society, agricultural labor and climate issues shifted. England's ability to continue to support its population without organized efforts of poor relief. By the 1590s, this picture worsened. The death rate increased by over 20%, real wages fell, and food prices increased. Famine resulted from poor harvests of 1596 through 1597. By 1601, the Elizabethan state created the Poor Laws, advocating compulsory apprenticeship and adult occupational work. Thus, from this time, it was sinful to waste time that should have been spent working. As a culture, the English practiced family planning. If the young people conformed, the number of children produced during the lifetime of a marriage met the number of deaths proportionately. In addition, English marriages were typically late as compared with other European societies. In England, a young adult would likely marry in their mid or late 20s. This limited a wife's childbearing years to about 15. Allowing for 3 years between births, 1 year pregnancy, and 18 to 24 months for lactation, this family would likely produce an average of 4 to 5 children per household. Keep in mind, child mortality contributed to the loss of sometimes all of the family's child population during high occurrence of epidemics. Lastly, education and training for adult economic viability was stressed in this culture. Apprenticeship, domestic service, or university training took years to complete. This, for the most part, kept young people from entering early marriages unless they could afford it. With the dissolution of the monasteries, great estates were created from former church property holdings. While the government gifted about 5% of these lands, the bulk of former church lands were sold to the nobility and non-titled aristocrats, raising in wealth but lacking in social standing. As such, this group, known as the gentry, wished to improve this condition. The one way in England was to purchase a landed estate and live in the countryside. In addition to such cases, former church lands were purchased by towns and others became crown land. This enabled church hospitals, colleges, and other institutions to continue to function as they had done for centuries, but under Anglican principles. By 1593, Queen Elizabeth tightened religious authority with the Act Against Puritans. The Puritans wanted to rid the Church of England of its familiar Catholic identity to include the religious hierarchy along with elaborate church rituals of ceremony and display. For Puritans, the King's Church looked very Catholic-like, with its stained glass windows, statues, artwork, and elaborate cathedral ceilings. From 1593, such religious radicalism was considered treasonable. It challenged the established social and political order, as well as the religious order. It became illegal to worship in any church except the Church of England. Puritans and other anti-Anglican sects who preached disobedience to Anglican authority were persecuted, jailed, and perhaps would lose their jobs. During the Protestant and English Reformations, religious wars were seemingly constant. One such history is the Anglo-Spanish War between 1585 and 1604. During her reign, Queen Elizabeth proved to be an intelligent and skillful queen, and up to the manly job as ruler. A political issue that challenged her right to rule lay in her being illegitimate and having a cousin that was legitimate. This, of course, would be Mary, Queen of Scots. In her private circles, some supported the ousting of Elizabeth and the crowning of her Catholic cousin, the rightful heir, which would return to England its religious heritage. In 1567, after a political coup in Scotland, Mary Stuart was forced to abdicate. She wrote her cousin Elizabeth hoping for political asylum. However, this gesture, seeking hospitality, was interpreted by the English government as the first step in dethroning Elizabeth. Of course, Mary saw herself as the rightful heir, though she kept these thoughts close to the vest. In England, Mary was not exonerated from the murder plot that had led to the death of her husband. After much consideration, Elizabeth had her cousin imprisoned. Under house arrest, the Scottish royal had her son removed from her care and brought up as a Protestant. After 19 years of imprisonment, an assassination plot was uncovered in 1586 against Elizabeth. This sealed the fate of Mary Stuart, Queen of Scotland. As a contributing conspirator, Mary was put on trial for treason. The court found her guilty. Mary stated simply, quote, "My heart is my own," end of quote. The two royal cousins, through it all, never met, as Mary had long hoped they would. Age 44, Queen Mary was beheaded on a cold morning of February 8th, 1587, buried in Westminster Abbey. Elizabeth's government set into motion a series of events that turned into a war with Spain by 1588. While this war was fought over 19 years, the turning point is remembered with the invasion of the Spanish Armada. Spain's King Philip II was angered over Elizabeth taking the life of her Catholic cousin, in his view the rightful British Queen. In response, Philip's navy sailed to England to depose Queen Elizabeth. Luckily for the English government and her tiny navy, even though they did have some help from the Dutch, the weather battered the Spanish Armada to such a degree the ships that did not sink limped back in humiliation to Spain. Keep in mind this was one of those instances in which the weather during the Little Ice Age could be quite severe. In the end, England declared God was on their side, and the war ended in 1604. This would bring in a new era of exploration and colonization. It was not until the 1500s that England was strong enough to challenge Spanish domination. Under Henry VIII and later his daughter, Elizabeth I, England built a strong navy and profited from a thriving merchant economy with money to invest in colonial expansion. There existed desire to expand into foreign markets to sell English goods, especially woolen cloth. Unofficially, Queen Elizabeth encouraged and funded privateers who preyed on Spanish treasure ships, sailing in convoys with gold, sugar, and spices from the Americas back to Spain. Sea captains like Francis Drake and Sir Walter Raleigh brought tons of gold to England as endorsed privateers, a government practice in which Spanish settlements were raided and their gold bullion seized before it could be loaded onto Spanish ships or en route. The Elizabethan theater style dominated the London and European scene from the late 16th century to the present day. The rise in theater productions led to the building of theaters across London. Puritans were sometimes successful in banning theater plays in England from 1642 and the colony of Massachusetts until 1750. As a result, the power of the Anglican Church and the dominant voices of public protest by Puritans, Elizabethan theater was banned in the city. This restriction of the 1570s worsened by 1596. This forced London playhouses to relocate to the south side of the Thames. In the time of Shakespeare, London playhouses tallied at about a dozen establishments featuring popular productions. While the first public London theatre was built in 1576, others followed in the 1580s and in the 1590s. The most enduring to Londoners is the Old Globe. Built in 1599 and, sadly, it burned down in 1613. It was styled after a Greek amphitheater in which sound could be best heard by patrons seated in front and on the sides of the stage, to which seating rose in levels. As productions increased in popularity, so did the money spent on scene designs, costumes, and other visual effects such as smoke, trapdoors for dramatic entrances, fireworks, and building facades. As intended, it captured audience attentions. Due to the lack of lighting effects, plays were held in the afternoon. Both men and women could attend these productions, while the cheap seats were near the stage at the ground level, and the more expensive seating was higher up in the box seats with cushioned seating. However, Elizabethan acting was masculine. Men played male roles and younger boys played the roles of female performers. The Black Death, otherwise known as the bubonic plague, revisited London on 3 occasions between 1593 and 1608. As such, public health issues were known to temporarily hamper production schedules. In the event a production could not perform, factors of actor illness or death and the lack of attendance by audiences were likely culprits. Other than this, theater productions were broadly popular and proved profitable as an enterprise. Shakespeare and other English writers adopted new techniques that fostered popularity in their work. This shift in writing style held the characteristics rich with personal experiences and feelings. This influence marked among the 38 plays by William Shakespeare, influenced the direction of theater more so than any other writer of English literature. The works by Shakespeare portrayed history to the day-to-day life of men and women across the economic spectrum. Characters, plots, and their representations range from being fictional to actual persons. Dramas and tragedies depicting actual experience portrayed on stage drew big crowds. Romeo and Juliet evaluated themes of love, family obligation, and the choices that lovers may or should not make. In doing so, Shakespeare's characters came to life on stage with realism and emotion. Scholars have suggested that this self-reflective view of individual experience was a product of the doctrines of Calvinism. Following the teachings of John Calvin, the pious were required to reflect upon their actions, done or those that might be done. As such, personal responsibility regarding sinful behavior fell to the sinner. Sir Walter Raleigh, the English explorer under Queen Elizabeth, was in deep trouble in 1595. An expedition he had led to South America in search of Manoa, a fabled city of gold, had not gone as planned. In order to keep the political and financial backing necessary to contribute to his search for New World riches, Raleigh would have to put the best spin on a bad situation. Fortunately, he was up to the task. After he returned to England, he published a narrative of his voyage titled The Discovery of the Large, Rich, and Beautiful Empire of Guiana. While he did not find gold, he had captured the imagination of readers that would lead to the discovery to be published into 5 languages. The discovery also included images of some of the animals and the fantastic creatures that inhabited the New World. A land of golden-laden Indians, grazing deer by riverbanks, while alligators swam by. When Raleigh and his contemporaries wrote about the New World's environment, they relied on mental framework inherited from Europe's medieval past. Pagan folklore, beliefs, and traditions also shaped how Europeans perceived the New World's environment and the forms of life sustained in it. Because Greek and Roman mythology taught Europeans that unusual creatures had magical, evil, or superpowers, many European explorers rendered that they saw in the New World as strange or monsters, as it would be the case with the opossum, as it resembled a fox, monkey, man-like owl creature. The first images of the New World seen by Europeans were made possible by technological innovations in book publishing that occurred in the decades before Columbus's voyage in 1492. Movable type meant that books, maps, and other printed materials could be produced in greater quantities and at a lower cost than ever before in history. Even the illiterate and the semi-literate were drawn to printed books and pamphlets, especially if they contained images. In the medieval era, the Catholic Church relied on using strong images to convey the spiritual meaning of Christianity to the faithful, such as pictorial stories featured in stained glass windows. Some expeditions to the Americas included illustrators, and this first-hand evidence greatly helped the printer preparing images to be reproduced. Most often, however, the images were greatly distorted to create grotesque scenes, picturing exaggerated features and monstrous human-animal body part combinations set in fruitful or dangerous landscapes. What could colonies offer the British government? What were some conditions? What raw materials were to be had only waiting for Englishmen to come along and make use of them? The artist illustrated, this particular illustrator, John White, was sent by Sir Walter Raleigh in 1585 to make some drawings, taking stock of New World possibilities. During this journey, he made numerous sketches of the landscape and the people he encountered. White's drawing resulted in heightening the interest for Englishmen to pursue the colonial setting in North America. His visual representations, though sometimes romanticized, illustrated Native Americans as intelligent, strong, attractive, and operating in organized agrarian and also hunter-gatherer tribes. Another sound publication that argued in favor of English colonization of North America was published in 1588 by Thomas Harriot, a brief and true report of the Newfoundland of Virginia. Like his contemporaries, Harriot was a close relative of Raleigh. What I mean here is he was an associate. Harriot's true report was very popular in regards to reading in Europe. It included detailed illustrations. Such was standard for the time. More than an observer, the scholarly mathematician took a scientific approach to contribute to the understanding of the Algonquian natives of the Carolinas. After an absence of 4 years, John White returned to the English colony of Roanoke, an island off the coast of what is now North Carolina. White, who was to serve as the colony's governor, had sailed there with 117 colonists in May of 1587, and late that summer had gone back to England for supplies. The sailing of the Spanish Armada in 1588 prevented White from leaving England as soon as he had planned. Not until March 1591 was he able to sail from England back to Roanoke. Upon his return, the settlers had disappeared, and to this day their destiny or demise remains a mystery. Roanoke, financed mainly by Sir Walter Raleigh, was England's first attempt to start a colony in the New World, placing it well behind Spain and claiming land and planting settlements there. Naval strength played a part in this as well. Later in 1599, Richard Hakluyt published the Principal Navigations, which also influenced the interest in English colonization. These accounts included descriptions of Native Americans, products, along with fishing grounds and other resources in a way that persuaded readers to settle in these areas. The first governor of Jamestown was Captain John Smith, a young man in his late 20s by 1607. Early accounts of Jamestown, a few books such as that were published by him, a few books included True Relation that was published in 1608, along with General History of Virginia, New England, and the Summer Isles, which would follow. For those wishing or planning to create a life in America, exploration literature made for popular reading and reference material was necessary. What reasons would inspire men to leave England and undertake a long, rough ocean voyage, to begin life in a wilderness surrounded by hardship? What would motivate men to risk money to outfit ship and send colonists on such high-risk ventures? Many men simply thought to increase their wealth by inventing trading companies. English company members shared the expense of furnishing ships with supplies in the hope of profiting from gold, furs, and timber, like the French and the Spanish had done. Younger sons of noble Spanish families, known as hidalgos, were sometimes motivated by the opportunity to acquire estates of their own, because in that time primogeniture required that the eldest son inherit all of the father's land. Some were looking for adventure and excitement as well. In 1585, Richard Hakluyt, English geographer, voyage diarist, and the investor of trading companies, listed reasons, among others, for English colonization of America. So I'm going to mention a few here. Number 1, glory of God by planting of religion among these infidels. Increased the force of the Christians. Number 2, the possibility of enlarging the dominions of the Queen's most excellent majesty, and consequently of her honor and her power by this enterprise, along with revenue. And this is number 3, an ample market to come of the woolen cloths of England, especially those of the coarsest sorts, to the maintenance of the poor that else starve or become burdensome to the realm. So these are in the words of Hakluyt. Number 4, a great possibility of further discoveries of other regions from the north part of the same land by sea, trade with Asia. So they were looking for a northwest passage. In return, trade received, this would also, a blue dye, it was called woad. This was in high demand. They were looking for this, and also there would be others such as indigo. Other products included hops, oil, wine, salt, and other commodities. They were much needed in Britain at the time. So that was number 4. All right, so number 5, that our Navy not be subject to arrest of ancient enemies, because they would build strength in having a larger navy of their own. Compared to the French and the Spanish, the English lagged far behind in establishing thriving American colonies. Yet the lure of the discovery of riches combined with economic competition kept the dream of English settlements in North America alive. All the while from the 1400s, merchants and traders and policymakers brought with them their long hatred of the Spanish and Catholicism. Thus, not trading with Spain for tropical goods made economic and political sense. Unforeseen was the war with Spain. Established by charter granted to Sir Walter Raleigh, Roanoke, an abandoned colony, continues to interest scholars in our present day. When the Roanoke colony ran low on supplies, it was decided that a ship would return to England for provisions. But as I mentioned, this was delayed until 1591 that it would return. And then, of course, the settlement was deserted. Early in the 1600s, when England began to establish permanent settlements, Virginia was vaguely defined as the area north of Spanish Florida, situated on the Chesapeake Bay. Sir Walter Raleigh eventually transferred his right to establish a colony to a group of London merchants. Out of this grew 2 joint stock companies. All right, so number 1, the Virginia Company of London and Plymouth, that were granted a charter to establish colonies on April 10, 1601 by King James I. The London Company, also known as the Virginia Company, sent out 3 ships and 104 colonists on December 20th, 1606. A bad time of year to be sailing, settlers did not arrive in Virginia until April 26, 1607. Number 2, the Plymouth Company, that would follow the Jamestown settlement in 1607 to Maine, failed. The first year of settlement in Jamestown, Virginia, contained no women. The colonists of Jamestown were a mixed bag of adventurers who were there to make money quickly. These early colonists were not interested in creating permanent buildings or constructing a fort. Largely, they were there to look for furs and gold. In their occupations, there was a range from gentlemen by type, who possessed no practical skills in colonial projects, to soldiers, carpenters, bricklayers, a tailor, barber, and a blacksmith. There was only one clergyman, a surgeon, and a young boy. What did the colonists do? Most of the first colonists preferred to search for gold rather than work. They had no desire to clear land, plant gardens, build a fort, or guard against Indian attacks. Finally, colonists realized that they would have to plant and cultivate their own winter food stores. Smith wrote to the Virginia Company owners pleading for colonists experienced in fishing, farming, and practical labor. Jamestown was badly suited and planned because of a variety of issues. First of all, it was built on a low, swampy, and sandy island peninsula in the James River on the Chesapeake Bay. However, after taking the advice of the company, they did not settle near the open ocean, but into the interior. It lay 30 miles from the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay, where it met the Atlantic water at that point. The site's only advantage was that ships could be tied to the trees along the river's bank. It was an unhealthy spot generally, full of mosquitoes in the summer. In time, on this indefensible sandy spit of land surrounded by water, the Jamestown colonists built a flimsy fort that offered only little protection from Indian raids. Many of the colonists preferred to live in a state of permanent camping-like conditions. At first, they lived in tents instead of building sturdier shelters. Lastly, whatever food supplies they brought with them from England spoiled in this climate. As a result of climate and local conditions, combined with the lack of food, this led to malnutrition. Jamestown settlers experienced a high death rate that continued for decades. In the early years from 1607 through the winter until January of 1608, only 38 out of the 104 original settlers had survived. While Smith was in charge as governor, he reminded the colonists that all the power rested with him, and that if they did not work, they were not going to eat. The following year, Smith returned to England, and this was due to illness. He recovered, but he did not return to Jamestown. He wrote instead. In 1609, the Virginia Company was reorganized and granted a new charter. This document stripped the Jamestown Colonial Council of its powers, and they became advisors instead. With subsequent charters in 1612 and 1618, Virginia encouraged agricultural pursuits while turning a profit for the company financiers. But these efforts took years. Colonists starved or barely subsisted until 1612. With the return of more colonists and the inability to turn a profit in those early years, the company remained perpetually in debt. By 1618, the company had poured more than $10 million into the settlement without receiving any return on their investment. In the years prior to John Rolfe's arrival in Jamestown, John Smith's unproductive meetings with the Powhatan natives provided an insight that the colonists, if not begging, were stealing food. While stealing had occurred, Smith traded with Indians for tobacco, and this product ultimately became the basis upon which Virginia was to thrive. But the tobacco native to Virginia was disliked by Europeans. They much preferred the sweeter, more fragrant tobacco successfully grown on the Spanish islands in the Caribbean. Until seeds of this tobacco were successfully grown in Virginian soil, a number of commodities were attempted for export, but none proved valuable enough to make the colony self-sustaining. The first cargo of goods as freight to be shipped from Jamestown consisted of sassafras and cedar plants. These are herbs and timber. Iron pyrite was sent as gold, but discovered as a fraud. Famine swept through Jamestown on and off from 1607 through the early 1610 year. In 1610, the Deliverance and the Patience, these are two vessels, finally arrived at Jamestown with expected supplies. However, instead of supplies, the vessels brought 60 more colonists. Jamestown residents were angry, but pitied the new arrivals. John Rolfe was one of the 1610 colonists who arrived on the Sea Venture. He had wintered, unlike the previous arrivals, in Bermuda. Unknown to anyone, he had smuggled out of the Caribbean prized tobacco seeds. In 1611, when he arrived in Jamestown, he introduced the Spanish-type tobacco seeds as an agricultural experiment. With the arrival of indentured servants and this tobacco strain, Jamestown was saved. By 1612, Jamestown had its first crop of tobacco, but it would be months after harvest and curing to know how well it would be received on the English market. About this time, John Rolfe's wife died. She had lost their child and never fully recovered from the sea voyage. In 1614, Rolfe married an Indian girl, at the time 18 years old, whom John Rolfe would later credit with the saving of his life in 1608. Pocahontas, Powhatan's favorite daughter, had been kidnapped by Jamestown colonists, according to the chief, and held as hostage to prevent Indian attacks upon the English settlement. Apparently, Pocahontas preferred life in the English colony to that in her own village. She converted to Christianity and was baptized Rebecca when her romance with Rolfe developed. He wrote the Virginia Company governor for permission to marry the Indian princess. Permission was granted, and they were married in a great ceremony attended by a number of Indians. In effect, Rolfe was the economic and political savior of Jamestown. Rolfe's tobacco was well received by London buyers. Pocahontas and Rolfe had a son that they named Thomas in 1615. In 1616, the planter and his Indian bride sailed for England aboard a ship carrying more tobacco. Pocahontas became the rage of London. She was often the guest of honor at parties. But in 1617, Rebecca caught a flu, or some say that it might have been smallpox, and thereafter she died. In the same year, Jamestown colonists were shipping 50,000 pounds of tobacco to England. Some say a value with an estimated worth in today's money equal to $1 million. Rolfe decided to leave his son in England in order to receive an education, and then Rolfe returned to Jamestown. And he married again, this time to a daughter of one of the colonists. Until his death in 1622, he became quite active in Jamestown politics and continued his effort to improve the quality of tobacco grown in Virginia. With tobacco, the Virginia Company was a success. New settlements developed as tobacco planters cleared land up the peninsula and began to move inland from the river. As the English settlers continued to encroach on native hunting grounds, along with other factors, this caused tensions to increase between the colonists and the Algonquian-speaking natives in Virginia. Problems would continue to plague the early Jamestown colonists in Virginia. In 1617, Jamestown was hit with smallpox. Smallpox introduced by European explorers and colonists raged through New England and spread south to Virginia, where it killed the Powhatan chief and many of his tribesmen. Disease constituted another of Jamestown's problems. New settlers brought with them scurvy, the plague, and various tropical diseases, such as yellow fever, contracted in Bermuda and other Caribbean colonies. In addition, it has been estimated that half of every shipload of new settlers came down with malaria, pneumonia, or dysentery landing in Virginia. Of those taken ill, most would die. In 1618, wheat growing was attempted in Virginia and proved to be a success alongside the planting of tobacco. But unlike wheat, tobacco proved to be labor-intensive. British indentured workers died by the hundreds soon after arrival. For Virginia settlers, the acquisition and retention of a stable workforce continued to plague residents. Soon, Virginia planters took the advice of the successful West Indian Dutch sugar planters who were growing products such as tobacco on the Caribbean islands regarding their labor issues. This led to the importation of the colony's first black laborers, while British indentured servants continued to pour into the Virginia settlements. Also in 1618, the House of Burgesses met to set a minimum price for the sale of tobacco and to establish plans for the creation of the first ironworks of the colony. Dutch traders looking for supplies brought with them in 1619 less than 20 African slaves to sell in Jamestown in exchange for supplies. Planters knew of the success of using slave labor on Spanish, French, and Dutch sugar islands in the Caribbean. Forced conversion of British society from Catholicism to Protestantism altered the social and political fabric. King Henry VIII's England, established by a set of parliamentary laws, Britain had broken with the Church of Rome. As a result, it had fashioned in the 1530s a national church, the Church of England, headed by the king and supported by the government through tax money. Although the position of the new church was secured and the country prospered under Henry VIII's daughter, Elizabeth I, from 1558 to 1603, the break with Rome marked the beginning of more than a century of religious dissension in England. While Catholics hoped and plotted for England's return to Roman alliance, others believed that the break with the Pope had not been clean enough and needed reforms. Many Puritans were members of an increasingly affluent middle class, landowners of wealth, but most were gentry along with some aristocrats, having created their wealth as merchants and manufacturers or from land production. By the 1580s, under Queen Elizabeth, the number of Puritans in Parliament had significantly grown in number. Their voices and opinions, along with concerns, could not be ignored. These religious reformers agitated but stayed within the church to work towards that reforming end. The main movement of religious reform was done through Puritanism. Differences between Puritans and Separatists were as follows. Unlike the Separatists that would be accused of treason against their king because their religious principles and practices, the Puritans accepted the practice of church and state and pushed for reforms instead. Puritans differed from the more radical Separatists on the issue of church hierarchy. For example, for Congregational Separatists, no hierarchy existed within their religious framework because the congregation voted for and hired their own ministers. Alternatively, Puritans adopted Presbyterian practices. These are the Scottish Protestants. These practices to give groups of ministers power to put pressure, if they saw fit, on an individual church or clergy. The small and more radical group of English separatists as Congregationalists in Scrooby, 150 miles north of London, established their own churches and oftentimes met in secret as they were breaking the law. While rituals and practices of worship differed, one foundational principle that later took hold in the American colonies and in the formation of the Republic later on was the separation of church and state. Separatists argued that a civil authority should not be in charge of a religious body. There should be no connection between church and state. This one principle alone denounced the authority of the English monarch as the head of the English church. Together with their austere practices and principles, this made separatist radicals. While set apart culturally from other English citizens, they chose to secretly move to seek religious tolerance in the Netherlands. By 1607, the Scrooby separatists had done what they had intended. It is important to note that once in the colonies, this principle of separatism did not hold true for the Pilgrims in southern New England. In colonial British America, the Pilgrim leaders found that it was impossible in practice to separate church and state in order to create a moral community. In England at the time, such religious radicalism was considered treasonable. It challenged the established social and political order, as well as the religious order. For hundreds of years, English common law required communities to report crime. If they did not, they could be accused of wrongdoing, such as harboring criminals. The separatists lived in such a time when the eyes of the community were upon you. Thus, little went unnoticed. A group of people meeting in private in the middle of the night would seem suspicious to neighbors. William Bradford, a young man by 1607, was living with his uncle. His parents had died. He became a Scrooby congregational member. This religious congregation was located far north from London and their king. By 1607, it had become clear to the Scrooby congregation that they would have to leave England if they were to practice their religion and moral living. The separatists were unable to obtain exit visas to leave the country legally, and their first attempt to leave met with disaster. After walking to the sea for 60 miles, they were betrayed by the ship captain, who turned them over to the authorities. After being searched and relieved of their possessions, they were sent to jail and detained for about a month. Over the following term, small groups of separatists were able to make it to the Netherlands while others were captured on the beach and imprisoned. Later, many of them were able to escape, rejoining their families and friends waiting for them in Amsterdam. The Pilgrim congregation from Scrooby moved then to Leiden. However, in Leiden they were once again discontent as the years went by. There were a few reasons for this. Culturally, in regards to the Dutch language, habits, dress, recreation, ways of work, what they did was quite different than the dominant culture. And then, of course, there was the poverty that they endured. And finally, this Dutch culture was making an impact on their children, which was not acceptable. Late in the 1610s, members of the Scrooby congregation decided the Dutch were a bad influence on their children. The Pilgrims felt their children were losing their English culture. In addition, Dutch residents saw the Scrooby congregation as odd. For the Dutch, Sunday was a day of feasting and a general holiday from work, not a day to be spent entirely dedicated to God. By 1617, the congregation had begun talking of moving, perhaps again. Maybe it would be to the wilderness in North America. Perhaps there they could build an English colony and godly society. The impoverished Pilgrims could only dream and discuss their options. Because their king did not want them back in England, though he felt it was his duty to be their king as they were his subjects, in time he agreed to give them a patent to build a settlement north of Jamestown rather than have them back in England. The high points of Queen Elizabeth's contribution as Britain's Virgin Queen include a measure of peace to the land for the British people. It established the Anglican Church as the state church of England, with herself as its head. It supported her father's efforts to become a wealthier nation along with the following 5 points. Number 1, possession and retention of a navy and military presence, thus securing Britain from invasion. Number 2, support New World exploration. Number 3, the national economy was improving, strengthened economically. Immigration laws welcomed to England skilled textile workers who had fled the Netherlands. Whereas Protestants, they were persecuted by the Spanish who ruled that country at the time. The continued land policies of enclosure. This is principle number 4. The consolidating and fencing off of small farms and turning them into pasture land for sheep to supply England's growing woolen industry, and this also included common lands as well. All right, and finally number 5. Queen Elizabeth encouraged the development of English shipbuilding, especially warships, and overseas trade with Russia, Spain, and France. And as a result, these elements thrived. Well, this brings us to an end of another lecture presentation. Thank you.